Have you ever seen something defy gravity right before your eyes? Not with magnets, not with wires, but with sound alone. In the shadowy corridors of Soviet research facilities during the Cold War, scientists were doing exactly that. They were making objects float in midair using nothing but acoustic waves, and the West had no idea it was happening. This isn't science fiction. This is the story of one of the most fascinating and secretive research programs ever undertaken by the Soviet Union. A program that pushed the boundaries of physics, challenged our understanding of matter itself, and may have been developing technology that still hasn't been fully explained today. Welcome to the strange world of Soviet acoustic levitation. The basics. What is acoustic levitation? Before we dive into the depths of what the Soviets were doing behind closed doors, we need to understand what acoustic levitation actually is. Because once you grasp the fundamental principle, the story becomes even more remarkable. Sound is a wave. You know this already. When you speak, when music plays, when anything makes noise, it's creating vibrations in the air. These vibrations travel as waves, pushing and pulling air molecules in rhythmic patterns. But here's where it gets interesting. Sound waves don't just carry information, they carry physical force. Imagine you're at a concert, standing right in front of the speakers. You don't just hear the bass, you feel it in your chest, rattling your rib cage. That's the physical power of sound waves. Now take that principle and focus it, concentrate it, manipulate it with scientific precision. Acoustic levitation works by creating standing waves, patterns of sound where certain points experience intense pressure while others experience almost none. At specific nodes in these standing waves, the acoustic radiation pressure can be strong enough to counteract gravity. Objects placed at these nodes essentially get trapped, suspended in midair by invisible columns of vibrating air. Scientists in the West had theorized about this for decades, but theory and practice are very different things. Making it actually work, especially with objects of any significant size or mass, requires extraordinary precision and power. Which brings us to the Soviets and what they managed to achieve in the secrecy of the Cold War era. The Cold War context. To understand why the Soviet Union was experimenting with acoustic levitation, you have to understand the scientific arms race of the Cold War. This was an era when both superpowers were throwing enormous resources at any technology that might provide even the slightest edge. The Americans had the Manhattan Project and the space race. But the Soviets? They had their own vast network of research institutes, many of them completely unknown to the West. While American satellites watched for missile launches and troop movements, entire scientific cities were being built in remote corners of the USSR, dedicated to research that would make science fiction writers jealous. Acoustic levitation fit perfectly into this landscape. The potential applications were staggering. Imagine being able to manipulate materials without ever touching them. No contamination, no friction, no physical contact whatsoever. For metallurgy, for chemistry, for the manufacturing of sensitive electronics or pharmaceuticals, this could be revolutionary. But there were also military implications. Could acoustic waves be weaponized? Could they disable equipment or even harm personnel? Could they provide a way to detect submarines or aircraft that conventional radar couldn't see? These questions drove research programs in both the East and the West. But the Soviets had certain advantages. They had brilliant physicists who'd been working on wave mechanics and acoustics for decades. They had state funding with no questions asked. And they had something else, a willingness to push experiments, further than Western ethics committees might allow. The research facilities. The exact locations where Soviet acoustic levitation research took place remain somewhat murky even today. But we know about several key facilities. There was the Institute of Radioelectronics in Moscow, where some of the most advanced acoustic research in the world was being conducted. There were facilities in Novosibirsk, in the heart of Siberia, where the Akademgorodok Research City housed thousands of scientists working on classified projects. And there were rumors, never fully confirmed, of specialized acoustic laboratories in the closed cities, those settlements that didn't appear on any map. Where defense research, too sensitive, even for the usual classification system, took place. What we do know is that by the 1970s and early 1980s, Soviet scientists were achieving results that Western researchers could barely believe. Reports began filtering out through scientific journals, through defectors, through intelligence channels. The Soviets weren't just levitating small particles anymore. They were suspending objects of increasingly substantial size. One researcher, who later emigrated to the West, described seeing demonstrations where metal spheres, several centimeters in diameter, were held perfectly motionless in mid-air, rotating slowly in the acoustic field like tiny planets. Others reported experiments where liquid droplets were levitated and then manipulated into bizarre shapes, stretched and compressed by varying the sound frequencies, all without a single touch. The equipment itself was imposing. Large acoustic transducers, sometimes arranged in complex geometric patterns. Computer systems, primitive by today's standards but cutting edge for the time, calculating the precise frequencies and phase relationships needed to create stable levitation fields. Rooms lined with sound-absorbing materials to prevent interference. And always, the eerie silence of the laboratories themselves, broken only by the occasional high-frequency whine that signaled a test was underway. The experiments? Let me describe what actually happened during these experiments, based on the fragmentary accounts that have emerged over the decades. The basic setup involved placing an object in the space between two acoustic transducers. These weren't your ordinary speakers. These were precision instruments capable of generating extremely high-intensity ultrasonic waves, far beyond the range of human hearing. When activated at precisely the right frequency, the transducers would create a standing wave between them, and the object would rise, trembling slightly, until it found equilibrium at one of the pressure nodes. Simple enough, in principle. But the Soviets pushed far beyond this basic demonstration. They developed multi-axis systems that could levitate objects and then move them through space, creating what some observers described as acoustic tractor beams. They experimented with different materials, metals, ceramics, organic compounds, even living tissue in some controversial experiments that remain poorly documented. One particularly fascinating line of research involved using acoustic levitation for containerless processing. The idea was to levitate molten metal droplets and allow them to cool in mid-air, free from contact with any surface. This created unique crystalline structures impossible to achieve through conventional metallurgy. Some materials scientists believe that certain Soviet-era metal alloys, whose properties Western researchers struggled to replicate, may have been produced using this technique. But perhaps the most intriguing experiments were those involving acoustic manipulation. It's one thing to make an object float. It's another thing entirely to control it with precision. Soviet researchers developed techniques to rotate levitated objects, to merge multiple droplets into one, to create standing wave patterns so complex that they could hold dozens of small particles in intricate three-dimensional arrays. There are accounts, difficult to verify but persistent, of experiments where larger objects were levitated, equipment weighing several kilograms, supposedly suspended for hours at a time. Some former Soviet scientists have hinted at research into using acoustic fields to dampen vibrations in mechanical systems, or even to create zones of reduced gravity for testing space equipment. How much of this is real, and how much is exaggeration or disinformation? That's the eternal question with Cold War Soviet science. The silence and the secrets. Here's where the story gets really murky. By the mid-1980s, something changed. The steady trickle of papers from Soviet researchers on acoustic levitation slowed, then stopped almost entirely. Conferences where Russian scientists had previously presented their findings suddenly featured no new acoustic levitation research. Why the silence? One theory is that the research had simply reached a dead end. Perhaps the practical limitations of the technology became apparent. Perhaps the funding dried up as the Soviet economy began its terminal decline. Perhaps the scientists moved on to other projects. But another theory is darker and more intriguing. Perhaps the research had become so promising, so potentially valuable, that it was pulled entirely into the classified world. No more papers, no more conferences, just silent work in unmarked laboratories, results never shared, breakthroughs known only to a select few. We know this happened with other Soviet research programs. We know the USSR had an entire parallel scientific establishment devoted to defense work, completely separate from the civilian research institutes. We know that some of the most brilliant Soviet physicists spent their entire careers working on projects that still haven't been fully declassified, even after the fall of the Soviet Union. Was acoustic levitation one of these programs? Did Soviet scientists achieve something remarkable enough that their government decided it was too valuable to ever discuss publicly? There are hints. Fragmentary references in declassified CIA documents express concern about Soviet acoustic weapons research. Reports from the early 1990s, as the USSR collapsed and some research facilities were opened to inspection, mention encountering acoustic laboratories with equipment whose purpose Western scientists couldn't immediately identify. And then there are the whispers from former Soviet researchers themselves. Carefully worded statements, implications that they achieved more than they were allowed to say, references to experiments that can't be discussed or results that were taken elsewhere. The modern perspective. Fast forward to today. Acoustic levitation is no longer a secret Soviet research program. It's an established scientific technique used in laboratories around the world. Japanese researchers at the University of Tokyo have created acoustic levitation systems that can manipulate multiple objects simultaneously. Scientists in Switzerland have levitated and manipulated tiny organisms without harming them. NASA has experimented with acoustic levitation for processing materials in simulated zero-gravity conditions. The basic physics are well understood now. The equipment has become more sophisticated, more powerful, more precise. We can do things with acoustic levitation that would have seemed impossible just a few decades ago. But here's the question that lingers. Did we actually invent all of this from scratch? Or are we rediscovering what the Soviets already knew? When you look at the timeline, some interesting patterns emerge. Certain breakthroughs in Western acoustic levitation research came shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, when scientific exchange with former Soviet researchers became possible. Some of the scientists who made these breakthroughs had studied at institutions where Soviet-trained physicists were now teaching. Correlation doesn't mean causation, of course, but it makes you wonder. There's also the question of what we still don't know. Modern acoustic levitation systems are impressive, but they still have significant limitations. The objects have to be relatively small. The acoustic power required increases dramatically with size. Stability is hard to maintain for long periods. But what if the Soviets found ways around some of these limitations? What if in those secret laboratories, during the height of the Cold War, they discovered techniques that we still haven't rediscovered? What if somewhere in a file cabinet in Moscow or St. Petersburg, there are research notes describing experiments that would astonish even today's acoustic levitation experts? The legacy. The story of Soviet acoustic levitation research is ultimately a story about the nature of scientific progress during the Cold War. It's about brilliant minds working in isolation, achieving remarkable things that the world would only learn about decades later, if at all. It's about the tension between scientific openness and national security, between the desire to share knowledge and the imperative to maintain advantage. We live in a different world now. Scientific research is more collaborative, more international, more open. The idea of entire research programs being hidden from the world seems almost quaint in the age of the internet and instant global communication. But the legacy of those Soviet experiments remains. Every time a modern researcher uses acoustic levitation to manipulate a cell without damaging it, to study the properties of materials in a containerless environment, to do something that would have been impossible with conventional techniques, they're building on foundations that were laid in those secretive Soviet laboratories decades ago. And who knows, maybe someday the full story will finally be told. Maybe some aging Russian physicist will publish their memoirs, revealing experiments and results that will force us to rewrite the history of acoustic levitation. Maybe classified documents will finally be released, showing just how far the Soviets really got. Or maybe the secrets will stay buried, lost to time, known only to the handful of people who were there and who carried their knowledge to the grave. The story of Soviet acoustic levitation tests reminds us that the history of science isn't always written by the people who make the discoveries. Sometimes the most important work happens in the shadows, documented in classified reports that may not see daylight for generations. We know the Soviets were working on acoustic levitation. We know they achieved significant results. We know the research largely disappeared from public view at a certain point. Beyond that, we're left with fragments, hints, possibilities. Maybe that's fitting. There's something appropriate about a technology that makes objects float in invisible fields of sound, being itself shrouded in mystery, hovering somewhere between confirmed fact and tantalizing speculation. The next time you hear about acoustic levitation in the news, and you will, because this technology is finding more and more applications, remember that someone, somewhere in the Soviet Union, was probably doing something similar decades ago. Remember that science has its secret histories, its hidden chapters, its untold stories, and remember that sometimes the most fascinating discoveries are the ones we're still trying to fully understand. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into the mysterious world of Soviet acoustic levitation, let me know in the comments. What other secret Cold War research programs should we explore? Hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll uncover more of history's hidden scientific stories. Until then, keep questioning, keep wondering, and never stop being curious about the world around you.